In the autumn of 1851, Sacramento County was a place where fortunes were made and lost with the turn of a shovel. The American River ran thick with the dreams of thousands, and the settlements that sprouted along its banks were as temporary as morning mist. It was here, in this landscape of mud and gold fever, that Margaret Ellsworth first laid eyes on the man who would change everything. The official records from the Sacramento County Courthouse show that Margaret arrived in California in the spring of 1850 with her husband, Thomas Ellsworth, a prospector from Ohio who had invested everything in the promise of gold. The couple settled in a canvas tent city that would later become part of downtown Sacramento, where Thomas worked a claim along the South Fork of the American River. According to the passenger manifest of the steamship Oregon, Margaret was 22 years old when she arrived, described as having auburn hair and gray eyes. Her husband was 38. The Chinese population of Sacramento County in 1851 numbered approximately 800 souls, most having arrived as part of the wave of immigrants seeking their fortune in the gold fields. Among them was a man known in the records as Li Wei Zhou, though his name appears in various spellings throughout the documents that would later surface. Zhou worked the river claims alongside other Chinese miners, sending most of his earnings back to family in Guangdong province. What began as a chance encounter at Turner's General Store on 2nd Street would spiral into one of the most disturbing cases of obsession and violence ever recorded in the early days of California statehood. According to a letter found decades later in the effects of store owner Benjamin Turner, Margaret Ellsworth began visiting his establishment with unusual frequency during the summer of 1851. Turner noted that she would arrive when the store was nearly empty, often in the late afternoon when most miners were still at their claims. The first documented interaction between Margaret Ellsworth and Li Wei Zhou appears in Turner's private correspondence to his brother in Boston, dated July 15, 1851. Turner wrote that he observed the two conversing in broken English and gestures near the back of his store, where tools and mining equipment were displayed. He noted that the conversation lasted nearly an hour, and that Margaret appeared flustered when she finally made her purchases and left. Thomas Ellsworth's mining claim was yielding modest returns that summer, according to records filed with the county clerk's office. His daily take averaged $3 to $4 worth of gold dust, enough to sustain basic living expenses, but far from the riches he had hoped to find. Neighbors later recalled that Thomas worked long hours at his claim, often departing before dawn and not returning until well after sunset. This schedule left Margaret alone for most of each day in their small cabin on the outskirts of what is now the Midtown district. The isolation of frontier life weighed heavily on many women of the period, but Margaret's situation was particularly acute. She had no family in California and few social connections among the other miners' wives. According to a diary fragment discovered during renovation of the old Methodist church on J Street in 1968, Margaret wrote of feeling like a ghost moving through each day, invisible to everyone around her except for the Chinese miner who had begun to acknowledge her presence with respectful nods when their paths crossed. The relationship between Margaret and Li Wei Zhou developed slowly over the late summer months of 1851. Turner's letters describe seeing them together on multiple occasions, always maintaining proper distance, but engaged in what appeared to be meaningful conversation. Zhou spoke some English, learned from previous work in San Francisco, and Margaret had apparently begun learning basic Mandarin phrases, though how she acquired this knowledge remains unclear from the surviving records. By September of 1851, their meetings had become more regular and less discreet. A report filed with the local constable by Mrs. Helena Morrison, wife of another prospector, states that she observed Margaret Ellsworth walking along the riverbank with a Chinese man on the afternoon of September 22nd. Mrs. Morrison's report, preserved in the Sacramento County Archives, notes that the two appeared to be walking very close together and that Margaret was carrying a small bundle of personal belongings. The last confirmed sighting of Margaret Ellsworth in Sacramento was recorded by the proprietor of the California Hotel on Front Street. According to hotel records dated September 28, 1851, Margaret entered the hotel lobby alone and asked to send a telegram to an address in Ohio. The telegraph operator, James McReady, later testified that the message was brief and that Margaret appeared nervous while composing it. The contents of that telegram were never recorded, as was common practice at the time when messages were of a personal nature. Thomas Ellsworth reported his wife missing to the county constable on October 1, 1851. His statement, handwritten on official paper and still legible in the county archives, describes returning from his claim to find their cabin empty except for a note written in Margaret's hand. The note, according to Thomas's testimony, contained only the words, "I have found what I was searching for," and was signed with Margaret's initials. Thomas noted that several of his wife's personal belongings were missing, including a small jewelry box that had belonged to her mother and the Bible she had carried from Ohio. The constable's investigation lasted only 3 days and consisted primarily of questioning other residents of the tent city about Margaret's whereabouts. Several witnesses reported seeing her in the company of Chinese miners, but none could provide specific details about when these encounters had occurred or where Margaret might have gone. The investigation was officially closed on October 4, 1851, with the notation that Margaret Ellsworth had likely abandoned her husband to return east, despite the lack of evidence supporting this conclusion. Lee Wei-Zhou's disappearance from Sacramento went unnoticed for nearly 2 weeks. Chinese miners often moved between claims or traveled to San Francisco to send money to family, so his absence did not immediately raise concerns among his fellow workers. It was only when Zhou failed to collect his share of a successful claim that his absence became a matter of record. According to testimony from Huang Lin, another Chinese miner who worked the same section of river, Zhou had been excited about a potential partnership that would allow him to bring his wife and son to California from China. Huang stated that Zhou had saved nearly $800 in gold dust and had been planning to travel to San Francisco to arrange passage for his family. The first real clue to Margaret and Zhou's fate emerged in the spring of 1852, when a Chinese merchant named Chen Wu reported finding personal belongings along a remote section of the Cosumnes River, approximately 30 miles south of Sacramento. Among the items were a woman's leather glove, a small mirror with an engraved silver handle, and what appeared to be pages torn from a Bible. Chen Wu turned these items over to the El Dorado County Sheriff, who noted their existence in his official log, but took no further action. Local newspaper coverage of the disappearances was minimal and reflects the racial attitudes of the period. The Sacramento Union ran a brief notice about Margaret's disappearance, but made no mention of her possible connection to Lee Wei-Zhou. The Chinese miner's disappearance was not reported in any local newspaper. As such, events were not considered newsworthy unless they involved conflict with white miners or issues of claim jumping. In the summer of 1852, a disturbing discovery was made by a group of prospectors working a new claim near the town of Folsom. According to the Placer County Sheriff's report dated August 12, 1852, the miners found what appeared to be a hastily dug grave containing the remains of 2 individuals. The condition of the remains made identification impossible, but among the burial site were found a woman's wedding ring and several Chinese coins. The sheriff's report notes that the grave appeared to have been disturbed by wild animals, making it difficult to determine the exact cause of death. The wedding ring found at the burial site was eventually identified by Thomas Ellsworth as belonging to his wife Margaret. The ring bore an inscription of the couple's wedding date, June 14th, 1849, which matched records from their hometown church in Ohio. Thomas had remained in Sacramento, hoping for news of his wife's whereabouts, working his claim with the desperate energy of a man who had lost everything except his determination to uncover the truth. Investigation of the Folsom burial site revealed additional disturbing details. The sheriff's examination of the scene found evidence that the grave had been excavated and refilled multiple times, suggesting that someone had returned to the site repeatedly over several months. Scattered around the area were fragments of cloth that appeared to match the description of a dress Margaret Ellsworth was known to have owned, as well as several items of Chinese origin, including carved jade pieces and what appeared to be religious artifacts. The discovery prompted a more thorough investigation, led by Sheriff Benjamin McCauley of Placer County. McCauley's final report, filed in September 1852, concluded that Margaret Ellsworth and Li Wei Zhou had likely eloped and were traveling south when they were murdered by bandits or hostile Native Americans. This explanation satisfied the legal requirements of the case, but several elements of the crime scene suggested a different and more disturbing truth. Dr. William Harrison, the only physician in Folsom at the time, was asked to examine the remains found at the burial site. His report, preserved in the Placer County medical records, notes several irregularities that cast doubt on the official conclusion. Dr. Harrison observed that the remains showed evidence of having been bound with rope before death, and that the positioning of the bodies suggested they had been buried while still alive. His report also mentions finding traces of quicklime around the burial site, indicating that someone had attempted to accelerate decomposition of the bodies. The investigation took a darker turn when Sheriff McCauley interviewed residents of the small Chinese community in Folsom. Through an interpreter, McCauley learned that Zhou had been seen in the area approximately 2 weeks before the discovery of the burial site. According to witnesses, Zhou appeared distressed and was seeking passage back to San Francisco, claiming that he and his companion were in danger. The Chinese residents reported that Zhou spoke of being followed by men who wanted to prevent his return to Sacramento. A merchant named Kim Yuen told McCauley that Zhou had attempted to sell several pieces of jewelry, including what appeared to be a woman's brooch, in exchange for safe passage to San Francisco. Kim Yuen's testimony, recorded in McCauley's notes, suggests that Zhou was desperate and spoke of a terrible mistake that had cost him everything. Zhou reportedly said that he had thought he was helping someone escape an unhappy situation, but had instead become trapped in something far worse than he could have imagined. The most disturbing evidence emerged when McCauley's investigation uncovered a pattern of missing Chinese miners throughout the region. Between April and August of 1852, at least 6 Chinese miners had disappeared from claims along the American River, Cozumnes River, and Mokelumne River. In each case, the missing miners had been known to possess significant amounts of gold dust or cash, and several had been seen in the company of unknown white men shortly before their disappearances. This pattern suggested that Margaret and Zhou's deaths were not the result of a random crime, but part of a systematic campaign targeting Chinese miners. The perpetrators appeared to be using various methods to lure victims away from populated areas, including promises of better claims, safe passage to San Francisco, or assistance with family reunification. Margaret's involvement in Zhou's disappearance may have been either voluntary or coerced, but the evidence suggests she became a victim of the same criminal organization that had been preying on Chinese miners throughout the region. The investigation stalled when Sheriff McCauley himself disappeared in October 1852. McCauley had been preparing to travel to Sacramento to interview Thomas Ellsworth and other witnesses when he failed to return from what was supposed to be a routine patrol. His horse was found 3 days later near Auburn, but Macaulay's body was never recovered. His replacement, Sheriff Davis Morton, officially closed the investigation into Margaret Ellsworth and Li Wei-zhou's deaths, citing lack of evidence and jurisdictional complications. Thomas Ellsworth remained in California until 1854, working various claims and pursuing any lead that might provide closure regarding his wife's fate. According to letters he wrote to his family in Ohio, preserved in the collection of the Ohio Historical Society, Thomas became convinced that Margaret had been murdered not because of her relationship with Joe, but because she had witnessed something that made her dangerous to powerful interests in the region. His letters describe a network of corruption involving local officials, merchants, and criminal elements who were systematically robbing and murdering Chinese miners. In his final letter from California, dated March 20th, 1854, Thomas wrote that he had uncovered evidence linking Margaret's death to a group of men who controlled several businesses in Sacramento and Folsom. He claimed to have documented proof of their involvement, but stated that he feared for his own life if he remained in California. Thomas promised to send the evidence to authorities in Washington, but no such documentation was ever received by federal officials. Thomas Ellsworth's departure from California marked the end of any official interest in Margaret and Joe's case. The rapid growth of the region and the constant influx of new residents meant that crimes from 1851 and 1852 were quickly forgotten as newer concerns took precedence. The tent cities where Margaret had lived were replaced by permanent buildings, and the mining claims along the American River were consolidated into larger operations owned by Eastern investors. The Chinese community's collective memory preserved details that official records had overlooked or deliberately omitted. Oral histories collected in the 1920s by Stanford University researchers include accounts of Li Wei-zhou's final weeks that differ significantly from the official version. According to these accounts, Zhou had discovered that several Chinese miners who had recently disappeared had been working claims that were subsequently taken over by white miners with connections to local officials. These oral histories suggest that Zhou's relationship with Margaret Ellsworth may have begun not as a romance, but as an attempt by Margaret to warn Zhou about threats to his safety. According to elderly Chinese residents interviewed in the 1920s, Margaret had overheard conversations at Turner's General Store about plans to drive Chinese miners away from their most successful claims. She reportedly approached Zhou to share this information, leading to a friendship that was misinterpreted by white observers as something more intimate. The accounts collected by Stanford researchers also include disturbing details about the fate of Chinese miners who attempted to seek justice through official channels. Several miners who had reported claim jumping or threats to local authorities subsequently disappeared, suggesting that the corruption Thomas Ellsworth had suspected was indeed real. The Chinese community developed its own methods of protection and communication to avoid becoming victims, but Zhou's association with Margaret may have made him a particular target. Dr. Mary Chen, the Stanford researcher who compiled these oral histories, noted in her 1925 report that the Chinese community's version of events portrayed Margaret Ellsworth as a victim rather than a willing participant in her own disappearance. According to these accounts, Margaret had been threatened by the same men who were targeting Chinese miners, and her attempt to flee Sacramento with Zhou was motivated by fear rather than romance. This interpretation casts their deaths in a different light, as the elimination of witnesses rather than the random murder of eloping lovers. The discovery of additional evidence in 1963 provided support for the Chinese community's version of events. During renovation of the old Sacramento County Courthouse, workers found a hidden compartment containing documents from the 1850s. Among these papers was a partially burned ledger that appeared to record payments to various individuals for services related to claim management and population control. The ledger included several Chinese names alongside payment amounts and dates that corresponded to known disappearances. The courthouse documents also included correspondence between local officials and representatives of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, which held significant business interests in California. The letters discuss concerns about Chinese miners sending too much gold back to China, reducing the amount available for investment in American enterprises. Several letters explicitly mentioned the need to reduce the Chinese population in mining areas through appropriate measures that would not attract unwanted attention from federal authorities. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a letter dated September 15, 1851, just 2 weeks before Margaret's disappearance. The letter, written by an unknown author to Samuel Morrison of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, described Margaret Ellsworth as a problematic woman who has been observed consorting with Chinese elements, and suggested that her removal from the community would serve multiple interests. The letter's author promised to handle the situation with appropriate discretion. The implications of this correspondence were staggering, suggesting that Margaret's death had been planned in advance and that her relationship with Joe had been used as justification for murder. The letter's reference to multiple interests being served by her removal suggests that Margaret had somehow become aware of the systematic elimination of Chinese miners and posed a threat to those responsible. Her attempt to warn Joe may have sealed both their fates. Analysis of the handwriting in these documents, conducted by experts at UC Berkeley in 1964, identified the author of several key letters as Benjamin Turner, the store owner who had first documented Margaret's meetings with Joe. This revelation cast Turner's testimony in an entirely different light, suggesting that he had been actively monitoring and reporting on Margaret's activities rather than simply observing them as an interested bystander. Turner's detailed knowledge of Margaret and Joe's meetings suddenly appeared more sinister than helpful. The 1963 courthouse discovery prompted renewed interest in the case from academic researchers and local historians. Dr. Patricia Holbrook of Sacramento State University began compiling a comprehensive account of crimes against Chinese miners in the 1850s, using Margaret and Joe's case as a central example of the systematic nature of anti-Chinese violence in Gold Rush, California. Her research revealed that at least 40 Chinese miners had disappeared from the Sacramento region between 1850 and 1855, far more than had been previously documented. Dr. Holbrook's investigation also uncovered evidence that the criminal organization responsible for these disappearances had connections to legitimate businesses and local government. Several merchants who had profited from taking over abandoned Chinese claims were found to have had business relationships with men suspected of involvement in the disappearances. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company, which had expressed concerns about Chinese miners in its correspondence, had subsequently acquired several mining operations at prices well below their actual value. The systematic nature of these crimes became clear when Dr. Holbrook mapped the locations of known disappearances against the subsequent ownership of mining claims. In nearly every case, claims that had been worked by missing Chinese miners were taken over within weeks by white miners who had connections to local merchants or officials. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to eliminate Chinese competition for the most profitable mining sites, with murders disguised as random crimes or voluntary departures. Margaret Ellsworth's role in this larger pattern remained ambiguous until 1967, when construction workers renovating Turner's former store discovered additional documents hidden beneath the floorboards. These papers included Margaret's personal diary, which had apparently been taken from her cabin after her disappearance. The diary entries from the summer of 1851 painted a picture of a woman who had stumbled upon a conspiracy and was struggling to decide how to respond. The diary revealed that Margaret had indeed overheard conversations at Turner's store about plans to drive Chinese miners away from their claims. Her initial entry about meeting Li Wei-zhou described him as a kind man who deserves to know what dangers surround him. Subsequent entries detailed her growing awareness that several Chinese miners had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and her belief that Zhou was being targeted because of his success at his claim. Margaret's final diary entry, dated September 27th, 1851, one day before her last confirmed appearance in Sacramento, conveyed her growing terror at what she had discovered. She wrote about overhearing Turner and another man discussing plans to solve the Zhou problem, and her realization that her own conversations with Zhou had been observed and misinterpreted as romantic involvement. The entry concluded with Margaret's decision to warn Zhou immediately and her plan to help him escape to San Francisco before it was too late. This final entry resolved the question of Margaret's motivations and confirmed that she had been trying to save Zhou's life rather than elope with him. Her murder, along with Zhou's, represented the elimination of witnesses to a broader campaign of organized crime. The portrayal of their relationship as a forbidden romance had been a deliberate misdirection designed to explain their disappearance while concealing the true motive for their murders. The diary also provided insight into the psychological toll that discovering this conspiracy had taken on Margaret. Her entries described sleepless nights, constant anxiety, and the feeling that she was being watched whenever she left her cabin. She wrote about her isolation and her inability to trust anyone in the community, including her own husband, whom she feared might not believe her or might inadvertently reveal her knowledge to the wrong people. The diary portrayed a woman trapped between her moral obligation to warn Zhou and her fear of the consequences. Dr. Holbrook's final report on the case, published in 1968, concluded that Margaret Ellsworth and Li Wei-zhou had been murdered as part of a systematic campaign to eliminate Chinese miners from profitable claims in the Sacramento region. The campaign involved local merchants, officials, and criminal elements working together to create an atmosphere of fear that would drive Chinese miners away while providing cover for outright murder when other methods failed. Margaret's death resulted from her discovery of this conspiracy and her attempt to protect Zhou from becoming its next victim. The report identified Benjamin Turner as a key figure in the conspiracy, noting his access to information about Chinese miners' activities through his store and his documented communication with interests that profited from their elimination. Turner's detailed observation of Margaret's meetings with Zhou suggested that he had been tasked with monitoring potential threats to the operation, and his subsequent testimony to investigators represented an attempt to control the narrative surrounding their disappearance. The broader implications of Dr. Holbrook's findings extended far beyond Margaret and Zhou's individual case. Her research demonstrated that crimes against Chinese immigrants in Gold Rush, California, were often not random acts of racial violence, but systematic campaigns orchestrated by business and political interests. The portrayal of Chinese miners as temporary sojourners, who frequently moved between locations, provided cover for disappearances that were actually planned murders designed to eliminate competition and witnesses. The case of Margaret Ellsworth and Li Wei-zhou also highlighted the vulnerability of anyone who challenged or threatened these criminal enterprises. Margaret's fate demonstrated that being white and female provided no protection when she posed a threat to powerful interests. Her murder alongside Zhou's sent a clear message to other potential witnesses about the consequences of interfering with the elimination of Chinese miners, contributing to the atmosphere of fear and silence that allowed such crimes to continue. The discovery of the courthouse documents and Margaret's diary in the 1960s provided closure to a case that had remained mysterious for over a century. However, the revelation that their deaths were part of a larger conspiracy also raised disturbing questions about how many other crimes from the gold rush period had been deliberately concealed or misrepresented. Dr. Holbrook's research suggested that the systematic murder of Chinese miners was far more extensive than had been previously known, with many cases still remaining undocumented. The academic community's interest in Margaret and Joe's case led to additional research into anti-Chinese violence in 19th-century California. Subsequent studies revealed similar patterns of systematic elimination in other mining regions, suggesting that the Sacramento conspiracy was part of a broader phenomenon that affected Chinese communities throughout the West. These findings contributed to a more complete understanding of the Chinese immigrant experience during the gold rush and the organized nature of the persecution they faced. The Chinese community's oral histories, which had preserved details overlooked by official records, proved crucial to understanding the true nature of these crimes. The accounts passed down through generations provided context and details that would have been lost if researchers had relied solely on official documentation. The preservation of these memories demonstrated the importance of community-based historical knowledge in correcting official narratives that had been deliberately distorted to conceal criminal activity. Margaret Ellsworth's story also served as an example of individual courage in the face of systematic oppression. Her decision to warn Li Weizhou, despite the personal danger involved, represented a choice to prioritize moral obligation over personal safety. Her diary revealed the internal struggle she faced in deciding whether to act on her knowledge, and her ultimate decision to help Joe escape demonstrated a commitment to justice that cost her life. The transformation of Margaret and Joe's story, from a tale of forbidden romance to one of murder and conspiracy, reflected broader changes in historical understanding of the gold rush period. Early accounts had emphasized individual stories of adventure and fortune-seeking, while later research revealed the systematic violence and exploitation that accompanied westward expansion. Margaret and Joe's case exemplified how official narratives could be manipulated to conceal organized crime while promoting simplified explanations that avoided uncomfortable questions about institutional complicity. The case files were officially closed in 1968, with Dr. Holbrook's report serving as the definitive account of Margaret Ellsworth and Li Weizhou's deaths. However, several questions remained unanswered, including the identities of other participants in the conspiracy and the full extent of their criminal activities. The passage of time had eliminated most potential witnesses, and many relevant documents had been destroyed or lost, leaving gaps in the historical record that might never be filled. In 1969, the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors approved the installation of a memorial plaque at the site where Margaret and Joe were believed to have been buried near Folsom. The plaque, which remains in place today, commemorates both victims and acknowledges the injustice of their deaths. The inscription reads, "In memory of Margaret Ellsworth and Li Weizhou, whose lives were taken in 1852. They died seeking justice and protecting each other from those who would profit from hatred and fear." The memorial represented a formal acknowledgement of the crimes committed against both victims and an attempt to correct the historical record. However, the simple bronze plaque could not fully convey the complexity of their story or the broader context of systematic violence against Chinese immigrants that their deaths represented. The memorial served more as a symbol of recognition than as a complete accounting of historical injustice. Local historians continue to research cases similar to Margaret and Joe's, seeking to document other instances of organized violence against Chinese miners that may have been concealed or misrepresented in official records. This ongoing work represents an effort to recover lost histories and honor the memories of victims whose stories had been deliberately obscured. Each newly discovered case adds to understanding of the systematic nature of anti-Chinese persecution during the Gold Rush era. The Chinese-American community in Sacramento has embraced Margaret Ellsworth's story as an example of cross-cultural solidarity and individual courage. Annual commemorations of Margaret and Joe's deaths serve both as remembrance of past injustices and as education about the importance of standing up against systematic oppression. These events bring together diverse community members to reflect on lessons from the past and their relevance to contemporary issues of justice and equality. Educational programs based on Margaret and Joe's case have been developed for schools throughout California, using their story to teach students about the complexity of Gold Rush history and the importance of primary source research in uncovering historical truth. These programs emphasize the difference between official narratives and lived experiences, encouraging students to question simplified historical accounts and seek out multiple perspectives on past events. The case has also influenced contemporary discussions about hate crimes and institutional complicity in violence against marginalized communities. Margaret and Joe's story demonstrates how individual acts of violence can be connected to systematic patterns of oppression and how official investigations can be compromised when authorities have interests in concealing the truth. These lessons remain relevant for understanding contemporary issues of justice and accountability. Research into Margaret and Joe's case continues to yield new insights about Gold Rush-era California and the experiences of Chinese immigrants during this period. Recent discoveries in private collections and family archives have provided additional details about their lives and deaths, while new analytical techniques have enabled researchers to extract more information from existing documents. This ongoing research demonstrates that historical understanding remains dynamic and subject to revision based on new evidence. The story of Margaret Ellsworth and Lee Wei-jo ultimately transcends the specific details of their deaths to represent broader themes of courage, justice, and the human cost of systematic oppression. Their case illustrates how individual acts of moral courage can occur even within contexts of widespread institutional failure, and how the search for truth can continue long after official investigations have ended. Their memory serves as a reminder that historical justice requires ongoing effort and vigilance to ensure that past crimes are acknowledged and their lessons remembered. The archives of the California State Library contain one final document related to Margaret Ellsworth and Lee Wei-jo, discovered only in 1969 during the final cataloging of Gold Rush materials. It was a letter written by Thomas Ellsworth to his brother in Ohio, dated 1855, 3 years after Margaret's death. In it, Thomas described a chance encounter with an elderly Chinese man in San Francisco who claimed to have known Joe personally. According to Thomas's letter, the old man spoke of Joe's plans to bring his wife and young son to America, and of letters Joe had written describing his friendship with a kind white woman who had tried to save his life. The man told Thomas that Joe's family in China had received word of his death through unofficial channels, but had been told he died protecting someone who had shown him unexpected kindness in a hostile land. This final piece of correspondence suggested that news of Margaret and Joe's true relationship had somehow reached China, where their story was remembered not as a scandal, but as an example of human decency transcending racial boundaries. Thomas wrote that learning this had brought him a measure of peace, knowing that his wife's courage had been recognized and honored, even if only by strangers in a distant country. The letter concluded with Thomas's observation that while California had taken everything from him, He had learned that individual acts of conscience could endure long after the systems that opposed them had crumbled. He wrote that Margaret had chosen to stand with truth rather than safety, and that her decision, though it cost her life, had created ripples that would outlast the temporary madness of gold fever and racial hatred. In 1873, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company was investigated by federal authorities for various financial irregularities. Among the evidence seized were copies of the correspondence found in the Sacramento courthouse 20 years earlier. Several company officials were prosecuted for fraud and conspiracy, though none were charged specifically in connection with the murders of Chinese miners. The systematic elimination of competition that Margaret had discovered was eventually exposed, but long after justice could be served to its primary victims. Benjamin Turner died in 1868, taking whatever additional knowledge he possessed to his grave. His store was sold to new owners who were unaware of its role in the conspiracy against Chinese miners. The building was demolished in 1895 to make way for a bank, eliminating the last physical reminder of the place where Margaret first encountered the men who would ultimately kill her for trying to do what was right. The mining claims along the American River where Joe had worked his final days were eventually consolidated into a single operation owned by Eastern investors. The small cemetery where Chinese miners had been buried was relocated twice as the city of Sacramento expanded, with most graves losing their markers in the process. Only through the efforts of local historians in the 20th century were some of these burial sites identified and properly commemorated. Li Weizhou's family, in Guangdong province, maintained a shrine to his memory for 3 generations, according to immigration records discovered in the 1980s. His son, who never made the journey to America, grew up hearing stories of his father's courage and of the American woman who had died trying to protect him. These family memories, preserved in letters between Chinese immigrants, provided confirmation of the basic facts uncovered by American researchers a century later. Margaret Ellsworth's grave in the hills outside Folsom was officially marked in 1975 when the Placer County Historical Society installed a proper headstone to replace the wooden marker that had long since rotted away. The inscription, chosen by descendants of both Chinese and Anglo pioneers, reads simply, "Margaret Ellsworth and Li Weizhou, they chose courage over silence." The case files remain in the California State Archives, a testament to the complexity of gold rush history and the importance of questioning official narratives. Researchers continue to study these documents, finding new details and connections that add depth to understanding of systematic violence against Chinese immigrants during this period. Each discovery reinforces the conclusion that Margaret and Joe's deaths were part of a larger pattern of organized crime that extended far beyond individual acts of racial hatred. Today, the site where Turner's General Store once stood is occupied by a small park in downtown Sacramento. A historical marker installed in 1985 briefly mentions the building's role in gold rush commerce, but makes no reference to its darker history. The Chinese-American community has proposed adding information about Margaret and Joe's story to the marker, viewing their case as an important example of cross-cultural solidarity during a period of intense racial conflict. The American River continues to flow past the sites where these events unfolded, carrying no memory of the dreams and tragedies that once played out along its banks. The tent cities and mining claims have been replaced by suburban developments and shopping centers, with only scattered historical markers remaining to indicate the region's violent past. Yet the story of Margaret Ellsworth and Li Weizhou endures, preserved in archives and community memories as a reminder that individual courage can transcend the hatred and fear that systems of oppression depend upon. Their case illustrates how truth can remain buried for generations before circumstances allow it to emerge, and how the search for justice can continue long after official investigations have ended. In a period when racial hatred was not only accepted but actively encouraged by economic and political interests, Margaret chose to see Lee Wei-jo as a fellow human being deserving of protection and respect. That choice cost both their lives, but it also created a story of moral courage that would eventually outlast the systems that destroyed them. The files were permanently sealed in 1976, marking the official end of investigation into crimes that had occurred over a century earlier. But the questions raised by Margaret and Joe's case continue to resonate, challenging historians and community members to examine how official narratives can be constructed to conceal systematic violence, and how individual acts of conscience can survive even when institutions fail to protect those who choose justice over safety. And in the end, that may be the most important legacy of Margaret Ellsworth and Lee Wei-jo, not the circumstances of their deaths, but the demonstration that human decency can persist even in the darkest circumstances, and that truth, however long buried, will eventually find its way to light.